and welcome back to the main stage at Event Sustainability Live. I'm Ed from HiSpace. It's been a privilege to listen to the discussions on this stage so far. So much insight. We've got another really interesting panel next on sustainable power. Please do, I would encourage you to keep your headphones on because the volume on the mics will be quite low. Yeah, I would wear the headphones. We would encourage you guys to ask questions of the panel. There's a couple of ways you can do that. Firstly, through Slido, so you can visit slido.com, or some of you might have the app. You can scan the QR code. You can use the code there to access the session. Submit your questions through your phone. They'll appear on here, and the panel will tackle them in good time. Those of you that prefer an old school way, we also have a roaming mic, so put your hands up and we'll get a mic to you if you want to ask a question. Just before we get started, another big thank you to our stage and indeed event sponsors, Evolution Dome. This magnificent inflatable structure. They come in all shapes and sizes. The Evolution Dome guys are exhibiting right behind us there, so if you are interested, then please do go and have a chat with those guys. We know them well at HiSpace, brilliant company to work for. So thank you again, guys, for sponsoring. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Tim Benson, who's going to lead this panel today on sustainable power. Tim.
Thank you. Good afternoon, and thanks for coming to our Powerful Thinking panel this afternoon. For those of you that aren't familiar with our work, Powerful Thinking is a not-for-profit organisation. We are the working group for sustainable power for the UK, for festivals, live events, sports events, broadcasts, pretty much anything that uses stuff with a plug on the end of it. The million-dollar question that we're asking this afternoon is, what constitutes a sustainably powered event? Now, I'm constantly bombarded with clients telling me that they don't need to do anything else on their event because they've picked a single sustainable power solution, and 9 times out of 10 they tell me, I don't need batteries, I don't need hydrogen, I don't need grid power because I'm running on hydro-treated vegetable oil, which is the current biofuel of popularity. Aside from my misgivings about biofuel, which I won't go into now because I spend my life biofuel bashing, there is never one single bullet solution for sustainably powering your event. It has to be decided, the solutions have to be decided on a best fit basis, and that will change from one event to another, from one event site to another. So I suppose what we really want to conclude this afternoon is, can we rely on a single solution? Is there one that stands out head and shoulders above others? Or do we need a combination of sustainable technologies, changes in attitudes, changes in behaviours to how we manage power across our sites? I have a very esteemed audience panel this afternoon, so thank you very much for joining me, guys. On my right here, I have Rob Long from Zenobe, Jenny Samuels from Festival Republic, and Jules Laver from PlusZero. And I'm going to ask each of them, first of all, to do a brief introduction and just tell us a little bit about themselves and the organisations that they work for. Over to you, Rob.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks for having me. I work at Zenobe Energy, and we're an owner and operator of energy storage, and that takes a few different forms. Initially, we started up developing utility-scale, grid-connected battery projects. So, for example, we're currently building a 400-megawatt battery in Scotland to help alleviate some of the constraints on the transmission network and getting the wind generation down the country. But in 2019, we also started supporting fleet operators go electric. We first did that by using our experience with batteries to help them overcome grid constraints and allow more power into a depot where the grid was constrained to allow that charging. And then following on from that, we found the other barrier for fleet operators going electric was the cost of the electric vehicle and the financing of the batteries on those vehicles. We liked owning batteries, so we said, hey, we'll own the battery on your vehicle, let's say it's an electric bus. If at any point that battery needs replacing, as it's forecast they will, because the range will eventually reduce as the battery degrades, we will replace the battery on that bus for you at our cost. And the battery that comes off, we have a residual value for, because we know that we can repurpose it and use it in a second life. And one of the avenues we've seen for redeploying these second life batteries has been in mobile units, which we've been deploying in temporary power applications. So we worked across a number of events deploying these second life batteries, using them to either make generators run more efficiently and reducing the fuel consumption on site, or by helping to connect to grid connections, boosting them, providing peak power when needed, and replacing the need for generators entirely. And we've also been able to use them as a buffer and a way to integrate renewables into temporary power projects, which is really is the holy grail. So that's been great to see.
Brilliant. And yeah, I can vouch. I've done some projects with Zenobe kit on site. It's all fully functional and great, completely silent running, emissions free. So it's a very good starting point in your journey into batteries. Jenny, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, your organisation, and your what I would like to describe as a highly unique role?
Yes, I can. Hello. I'm Jenny. I work for Festival Republic. We belong to Live Nation, so I suppose I work for Live Nation. And I am hired specifically to try and get some of the major UK festivals onto the national grid. So my sort of initial goal is to start with the main stage, which is kind of the most contentious part of the show, because if the main stage goes down, you don't have a show. And we have actually been investigating this for a while, and we found that it is in fact feasible to put a main stage onto the national grid, which I will go into a little bit more later. But as my fellow panelists have discussed already, we've also realised that there needs to be a bit of a combination in that process. Part of kind of Live Nation's and Festival Republic's goal is to reach a 50% reduction in carbon emissions by 2030. We've been on the road to doing that for a while. We've been using HVO fuel. We've used some battery sort of methods as well, and we have got a few grid connections at other points around our festival, but this is like our kind of piece de resistance, if you will, to put our main stages on the grid, and that's kind of my goal. Yeah, that's where I'm at.
That's really interesting, because I didn't realise that you were particularly targeting main stages. Is that kind of like a mandate, or? I think from what I've kind of gauged, when I first was told this was the initial kind of goal, I thought it was kind of more of a PR move that we could shout about and say we'd done the main stages. But since learning more about the process, I've realised that if you can put a main stage for a festival onto the national grid, you can do anything. Like, the main stage is the most challenging component, and there are lots of other aspects of the festival that would benefit from being on a grid, but they're easier. And so if you can do the main stage, which is the most challenging with the most peak loads and the most disturbances and all of the different things that come with that, like, then you really can start to look at putting the rest of the show on after that. Oh, I have a million more questions for you, but time is against us. So thank you very much, Jenny. Let's move on now to Jules, who's stepped in for David Amos from PlusZero. Probably one of the more controversial ends of the supply chain, dare I say it, Jules?
Thank you, Tim. Yes, my name's Jules. I work for PlusZero. I'm a technical solutions director. PlusZero in the business of using hydrogen to produce electricity. So we have a small fleet of hydrogen fueled generators, work in the same way as a diesel generator would, except the fuel is hydrogen. There are two strands to our business. We are also involved in, so PlusZero Power is the generator side of the business. PlusZero Energy is involved with the production of green hydrogen. So with both sides of the business, we're able to offer an end-to-end solution to the clients, both the generators for the on-site power generation, but also the fuel to feed those generators with.
Excellent. Are you able to name check a couple of festivals that you guys have worked on already?
Yeah, so we've worked the last couple of years at Hebcelt, which is a Hebridean music festival up in Stornoway on the Isle of Lewis. We have, over this summer, we've done a couple of the events of the World Cycling Championships, which are up in Scotland, and we've also done a couple of smaller events for Scottish Gas Networks to do with their H100 project in Leavenworth.
Brilliant. So a good repertoire, good roster there. Okay, I'm going to hit my panellists up now with some direct questions about the sort of solutions that they're offering. Please feel free to keep any questions that you've got for our Q&A at the end. We'll try and devote 10 minutes or so to that. If they're specific to a panellist, please mention that when you volunteer your question. If it's a general one, we'll attempt to answer it as best we can. I'm going to stay with Jules now and just start Jules, can you explain a little bit about hydrogen power generation? Because my understanding, and again, I'm a bit of a hydrogen basher, but that doesn't mean I can't be proved wrong. I grew up in this sort of era of HFCs, hydrogen fuel cells, and your technology is slightly different from that. Can you give us a sort of update on how things have changed, what's changed, and what the benefits are?
Yep. So probably the simplest way to explain it is to start from the production of hydrogen. So there are various different ways that hydrogen can be produced, and the hydrogen's color-coded according to the way the method it's used to produce. So we are principally in the business of using green hydrogen, which is produced by the electrolysis of water. So you put electricity in, you get hydrogen at one terminal of your electrolyzer, and you get oxygen at the other one. And as long as the electricity that you're using is entirely from renewable sources, that's green hydrogen. So there's zero carbon associated with the production of the hydrogen. A hydrogen fuel cell essentially does that process in reverse. It takes a hydrogen, combines it with oxygen chemically, and you get a current produced in your fuel cell. We currently use hydrogen combustion generators, so they basically work exactly the same way as a petrol engine would, except the fuel is hydrogen instead of petrol. You have a spark in the engine, sets fire to the hydrogen, and drives your engine. But again, the only emissions from that engine are basically the product of the combustion is water. So again, there's no carbon produced there. There is a small amount of NOx production from the engines just because of the heat of the combustion, but it's more than 90% less than the best kind of Cat 5 diesel engines. So it's and that's with no after treatment. So it's they're all classified as zero emissions engines.
Okay, so for those of the people in the audience that are not really familiar with DEFRA emissions figures, can you just explain briefly what makes hydrogen a better fuel, a more sustainable fuel than diesel, than HVO? What is it about it?
The fact that you can produce and burn your hydrogen, it's a cyclical process. You start with water and you end with water, and there's no carbon production there. So although there is an energy cost to producing that, as I say, as long as that energy is sustainable, in our case we use wind power that's currently not harnessed. So you've kind of got free energy to put into the system at the start of it that produces your hydrogen, and then that hydrogen in turn produces your electricity at the end of it.
So when the national grids basically say to some of the wind farms, etc., or the solar providers, we're going to have to curtail your production because demand has dropped across the national grid. Something that people probably don't understand about the difference between nuclear power stations and, say, gas power stations. Gas power stations are quite responsive. You can effectively dial them up and dial them down quite quickly, quite effectively, so you can control the output. Despite what people like EDF will tell you, nuclear power stations are far less controllable. And that means that at times of low demand across the national grid, but high generation, so windy days, sunny days, the actual renewable providers have to switch off, and they get compensated through our energy bills. It's called constraint payments. So I think what Jules is saying is that they're actually using that excess energy to actually generate a new fuel which is more sustainable.
Yeah, so for our small electrolyser that we have up in the Isle of Lewis at the moment, we are using curtailed wind, but as we scale that up, we'll also use wind that is currently consented to be built but hasn't yet been built because the interconnector between the island and the mainland is already at capacity. So at the moment there isn't the facility to kind of export more power from the island. So any more wind that's built needs to get used doing something on the island.
Great. So I mean, this sounds almost too good to be true. It's zero emissions at the point of use. You're just generating water. You can take that home for your goldfish. You could upcycle that. That's great. What are the limitations? Why aren't thousands of people perhaps hiring combustion ignition hydrogen generators or even HFCs for that matter?
So the two main constraints at the moment, and they kind of go hand in hand with one another, are the availability of green hydrogen and the cost of green hydrogen. At the moment, there are relatively small-scale electrolyzers that are producing green hydrogen. There's not a huge amount of it about, and consequently it's quite expensive. So it's a significantly more expensive way of generating your energy than using diesel or HVO.
I'm going to put you on the spot here now. If you had to sort of look ahead, look into the future, can you see when can you see sort of greater market penetration being achieved in terms of, say, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years?
So the stock answer to that question is a couple of years, but that was the stock answer a couple of years ago as well. But there is actually light at the end of the tunnel now, because there's the government subsidy program for hydrogen production, which there are now a few companies that are signed up for. There are a couple of electrolyzers that are either online or are going to come online, providing that subsidized hydrogen by the end of 2025, if not sooner. And at that point, the cost then becomes more or less, it will still probably be slightly more expensive than using diesel or HVO, obviously depending on what happens to the prices of those, but you'll be more or less at a parity. At which point then it does become much more of a no-brainer for people to swap over, because the technology is very familiar to people. That our generators look and feel and work very much like a diesel generator does. People that are using diesel generators would be very familiar with how to use them. So the only change is the fuel and the fuel storage.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Jules. That was a great introduction to hydrogen combustion ignition generators and also generating green hydrogen. Jenny, so tell us a little bit more about what a grid tie coordinator does day to day.
I wait a lot. No, I work with a lot of big sort of stakeholders. So I'm working with the DNO, the network distributor. I'm working with local authorities to get things like planning permission, landowners, local councils. So I do a lot of kind of stakeholder negotiations and navigating. But effectively, it's all down to kind of just, for me at least, I just have to push a lot, that especially with the DNO, you can get a kind of an in-between person. So let's say EDF as an example of a DNO. I'm sure everyone's familiar with EDF as a grid provider, I hope. Sometimes you can get a kind of go-between. You can pay them to be your kind of person that speaks between the two of you. We went without that because I'm quite a assertive, pushy person myself, so I just decided I was going to push anyway. And so I think that's a slight challenge for some people, is to kind of keep that conversation going, keep pushing the grid provider to actually reply and acknowledge your application and work with you and to provide you with a project planner. But it is entirely doable, and if you don't have the resources and the time to have those conversations and to be pushy with it, then you can hire someone that they can bring in, like an independent person that will help you navigate those conversations. Yeah, so that's kind of my day-to-day.
And just so everyone knows, a DNO is a...
Oh God, district network operator, that's it.
Yeah. So the national grid in the UK is a series of HV high voltage transmission lines that run over us or underneath us, that come from either gas or coal power stations. That power gets fed out to hubs across the UK, and the hubs are the DNOs, the district network operator. And you're probably familiar with UK Power Networks. They are a DNO, and UK Power Networks operate kind of all across the UK. They'll have DNOs up in Scotland, they'll have them down south, so they can cover a multitude of different areas. Any renewable energy generation is currently done at the DNO level. It's not connected to the national grid, and that's probably something that we'll touch on again. What is it then that, I mean, we were talking to Jules about what makes hydrogen, more sustainable power solution. What is it about the grid then? Why should we choose grid over hydrogen?
We're in a competition now. So, so I did I did a bit of a return on investment I did a financial one, but I also did a carbon saving one, and found that before we get into sort of conversations of hydrogen, HVO, and alternative renewable sources, just in terms of comparison to diesel, which is normally the cheapest fuel for our events, from a carbon saving perspective, there was a 78% reduction on carbon emissions if you use a grid connection. So already that's a pretty strong argument. The other thing is, with the grid, I found some data actually from the National Grid, which is that in 2010, I'm just find the exact statistics here. They had 20% renewable energy available to everyone in the country. Now, 2022, we're at 49% renewable energy. And as you'll have seen today, just being here, but you'll have heard probably on the news and what have you, there's constantly innovations in that area. There is so many people striving to make more renewable energy available. And as an events company, we're always trying to keep on top of the newest things. But if you connect to the grid, you don't really need to, because that happens for you. If we're connected to the grid and we are working with a renewable supplier, when new technology becomes available, we just benefit from it automatically without having to put in all that legwork of what works best for us and what have you. Like, that is one of the great advantages of the grid connection.
Yeah, I mean, the National Grid energy mix is basically made up of 4 distinct sectors. You have fossil fuels, so that's the contribution principally of gas generators these days. You have renewables, which in the UK is principally wind, solar, a bit of hydro. I'm not sure whether biomass is included in there or...
No, I didn't see it in the data I was looking at.
So then you have low carbon, which I think is biomass and nuclear. And then you have what's called interconnects, which is imports from overseas territories. And we are constantly, month on month, year on year, breaking records for the contribution of renewables to the national grid. Do you think there's a big issue between, if you do manage to get onto the national grid for one of your event sites, does it make a big difference if it's on a renewable tariff or just on a normal tariff?
It makes a difference. As an example, Live Nation's venues are all now 100% renewable energy, and that was actually when we switched, which was a few years back now, that was a 23% increase in our bills, if you will. So going on to that renewable energy tariff was more expensive, but it fluctuates, and year on year, they're trying to drive that price down to try and bring buyers into using renewable energy and to try and demotivate people using coal and other fossil fuels. So, it's a balance, but it is a slightly more expensive option, as often renewable and sustainable sources are. But in the long run, it becomes like a carbon return on investment, if not a financial one.
I mean, it's interesting to note that if you are on a renewable tariff, I think I'm right in saying it doesn't mean that the energy that you use, that you tap into, comes from a renewable source. What it actually means is your district network operator will compensate if your energy didn't come from a renewable source. They will compensate elsewhere within their network and supply a comparable amount of energy through renewables. So it doesn't guarantee you, it's kind of like an offset thing, isn't it, really?
Yeah, that's right.
Fantastic. And final question for you. I know this is probably going to be an impossible one to answer in a couple of minutes, but the process for going about having a grid installation, a mains installation on an event site, can you just take us on a whistle-stop tour through what that is, how it works, and what kind of timescales we're looking at?
I can. I'll do it as quickly as I can. I broke it down into 8 points. I'm going to whiz through them. So, firstly, you really want to understand how much power you need. So you need data, whether that's a full telemetry or just a vague understanding. You need that data. Secondly, you need to decide if you're putting in a new supply, there's not an existing grid connection. you will need a substation. And you're going to need to find a location for that. They can be up to about 10 metres long by 4 metres wide, so they're not a small building. So you'd need to find a suitable spot for that. You can do a feasibility test with the district network operator to see if there's actually enough power in the area. Not all of those operators actually make a feasibility test available, but if it is, I'd recommend doing it. Then you get permission from your landowner. They actually obviously need to give you access and permission to do this on their site, but also they need to give 24/7, 365-day a year access to the DNO to monitor, maintain the substation. So it's quite an undertaking for them. Then planning permission. You want to work with your local authority. I am at that point with certain festivals, and so far so good. Planning permission, I don't think is often a point of concern there. Then the best bet at that point is to apply for your grid connection once you've got your planning permission. There's normally a fee with applying. And once you've accepted the quote that the DNO give you, you can start constructing the substation and putting in the cables. So you'd go out to tender and do all of those things. And then your final step is to get an energy supplier, and hopefully a green one if you can. Now the timeline, I started this about a year ago. Within a year it is possible, but there are quite a lot of sticking points. At any point in that process there can be moments where it gets held up, whether that's the landowner doesn't feel too happy with the agreement that you have, or even that there's not enough power in the area. There can be sticking points. So I think if you were to really want to undergo this process and to apply for a new connection, you'd want a couple of years in the pipeline just to be sure you've got that wriggle room.
Yep, I think that's the perfect answer. Don't expect to apply for a mains installation on your site and in January and expect to have it ready for your festival in July. It just won't happen. One of the only jobs I had during lockdown was having a 100 kVA generator on Brighton Beach where I live, where they were building that outdoor pool because they waited a year and a half, 2 years for their grid connection. So I was quite pleased. I had a generator on hire, but they weren't so happy. But there you go. Thanks very much, Jenny. Now moving on to Rob quickly. Rob, you're in a slightly different kind of, well, you fit into the energy business on events slightly differently. Can you explain what that is? Because you're not really about generation, you're more about something else.
No, exactly that. We're about energy storage, and one challenge we have is people saying, let's get some of those electric generators on site. And what's really important to know is that batteries don't generate electricity, they store it. And whether that energy comes from a grid connection, a traditional generator, or from on-site renewables, the battery can be used to basically optimize how all of those generation sources can be used and distributed around the site and the event.
And there are many, many different ways in which batteries can be configured on event sites. They're configured in these different ways for different applications to do with different load profiles, different peak demands, that kind of thing. Can you explain maybe 2 or 3 ways in which you Zenobe get their batteries out and how they're configured and what the purpose is behind that?
Yeah, no problem. So we first got into this space because we put a second life battery on the Extreme E project working with Power Logistics. And that's a nice way to illustrate the different use cases, because initially the idea was to increase the efficiency of a generator. A diesel generator, if it runs on very low loads, then the engine won't get hot enough, combustion doesn't happen properly. For every litre of fuel you put in, you don't get enough energy out. A lot of you get worse exhaust, so you get worse pollutants in the exhaust, and you get particles that can clog up your generator as well. So if you can put a battery in which can power the load with the generator switched off, when the battery eventually runs low and will need recharging, it can send a signal to that generator, turn it on, run it at its most efficient rate, and then once the battery is recharged, it turns the generator off. So instead of that generator running 24/7 on a fairly inefficient fuel efficiency, it will now run for 3 or 4 hours a day at its most efficient rate. And by doing that, if depending on the project, you can save up to 80% of your fuel consumption on site. So that's how we started. But then, not long after, we went to Uruguay, where there was a very renewable. They have a very high percentage of renewables on their grid, and so but it's not as reliable. So we could use the batteries there to connect to the grid, boost that grid where possible, but also provide backup power so that if that grid did drop out, had brownouts or blackouts, the batteries could kick in, keep power going to the event while that grid was brought back online. And then recently what we've done is we've actually integrated temporary renewables. So there's a large array of temporary solar panels which we're feeding in via DC, as well as our on-site DC fuel cell, which we're feeding in via DC, and we're distributing that power via DC straight into the batteries, so you're skipping those conversion losses, and then the batteries can store that energy, provide it as AC power onto that island grid when needed. I hope I didn't get too technical too quickly. But
No, not at all. So the process of connecting, that Rob alluded to, of connecting to the grid and bolstering that supply, it's a process known as peak shaving. Batteries can do that with generators as well. You can downsize your generator.
Absolutely. So if you have enough data from a previous event and you know what your load profile is going to look like, you can size your battery and your generator so that you can have a much smaller generator with a battery that can provide the additional power, or you run that generator at times when the site load is very low and there's enough power from that generator to charge that battery. What you don't want to do is have an undersized generator where the battery is also run out of power, needs recharging, and then you don't have enough power on site to cover the load. So you do have to utilize the data, and that's another benefit of batteries, is inherently they're data driven. So every time you use one, you can have a report for the next event. But what I'm trying to get at is careful planning of a combination of a battery and other technology is really important to make sure that it's going to be a successful solution.
Absolutely right answer. and just going back to basics now, because I mean, there's probably a lot of people sitting in the audience going, battery, okay, is he talking about a AAA? Is he talking about a watch battery? Is he talking about a 12-volt car battery? Give us a sense of the size, the look, the feel of these units. What are people going to see when it comes in on the truck?
What you will see is something that looks a bit like a 150 kVA diesel generator, a big metal box, only it hasn't got an exhaust on the top. It's got vents on the side where the HVAC can cool the batteries down. You'll have a similar distribution, probably more of a digital display, but otherwise it will look fairly similar to a generator.
And again, the million-dollar question for you is lithium ion. That is the prevalent chemistry that we are using in the world of events and indeed across batteries generally at the moment. Why are people choosing lithium? And given the discussion, the debate around invasive mining, that kind of thing, poor recycling qualities, do you see is there another chemistry that you're looking to for the future, another battery chemistry?
Sure. So first, if we tackle why lithium, there's the blunt answer is because China decided that was where they were going to go. And China started with their transport electrification back in 2008, well ahead of anyone else, and they scaled up much quicker. So now the affordable and most effective technologies currently on the market are generally coming from the East, and that's why that is technology of choice. We have a fleet of around 1,000 vehicles around the country, and almost all the batteries on them will be coming from Asia. And that is why we are then taking those batteries to repurpose and put them in a second life. That's why we're using lithium-ion batteries in a second life. There are lots of other technologies which are being discussed. So there's some solid-state batteries which have some very promising characteristics, and I'm looking forward to seeing how that develops. Also, sodium-ion batteries is something that's touted for the future. So instead of using lithium, you're using salt, effectively, and there's a lot of benefits to using those as well. We like to be technology agnostic. We're an owner-operator of energy storage that could technically be storing energy in hydrogen. Our batteries in Scotland are doing the same thing and using excess wind to store energy to be used somewhere else. So those technologies are named, and any others we're definitely keen to try and work with.
Excellent. Going to go back to Jules quickly now. There is a lot of talk, particularly in the world of hydrogen automation, and hydrogen cars, etc. And they're talking about the efficiency of using hydrogen in combustion ignition. They're kind of arguing that it's about 40 to 45% efficiency. Regular diesel is in the region of about 50% efficiency, and then you jump up with electric drivetrains to about 75 to 85% efficiency. How do you deal with that as PlusZero?
Our hydrogen engines and generators have a similar efficiency to an equivalent diesel generator. but also a similar efficiency through the load profile. So as Robert mentioned, with generators at a low load, they work much less efficiently. So getting the generator working at that peak load is important to achieve the maximum efficiency. There is no question that the process of using hydrogen, both in producing the hydrogen in the first place and then using it in a generator, is quite lossy in terms of its efficiency. But if you're using untapped energy, wind resource to start with, that is currently not being used, you've kind of got that free energy input. So the fact that you're losing efficiency is less significant, unless there's going to be another use for that wind turbine to provide the electricity directly to an end user. Then essentially hydrogen needs to be looked at in the same way as the batteries do. It's an energy storage. And you thinking of it in that way rather than as a fuel is maybe a better way of kind of looking at it. But as I say, if the wind resource is free, and if it's not currently being used, then, as I say, the lack of efficiency in the process is offset somewhat by that.
Brilliant. Jenny, you work for Festival Republic, part of Live Nation. You have this unique new role which you can devote a lot of time and effort to. For smaller event organisers out here that just don't have the resource, the finance, the reach, the clout that Festival Republic do, what would be your advice to them if they were trying to get grid ties?
So firstly, a lot of it's surprising how many venues and greenfield spaces do actually have a grid connection. Maybe it's not main stage size, but it is available. We already use certain grid connections at some of our sites. And I don't know if people kind of realise what's available to them in the space that they're using. I do also know that there's a lot of councils currently in the UK who are trying to get a lot of their parks onto the national grid and provide little cabinets and what have you. We're working with some councils on the same sort of conversation. So in terms of kind of public spaces, there's going to be scope for people to connect to the grid. For a new supply, a new substation entirely, there's a few options. You could save, you could save for many years, but you've also got the option of partnering and sponsoring, working with a partner or a sponsor to provide some funding there, and it's tricky with the funding side of it, but certainly with the sort of having a person who's dedicated to it. I'm doing several shows. I'm doing quite a lot of shows to get them all on the grid. And if you've got one show, it is possible. It is entirely possible to add that into your kind of day-to-day workload, really, to just get the ball rolling and have those conversations. And as we've talked about, it's quite a long process. It's not an every single day you're working on it thing. It's having those initial conversations, putting in those applications, building those relationships with the stakeholders. As I said, there are companies out there that will help you with that process. I'm doing without some of them, but it is possible to kind of offload a lot of it to other people who are ready to go to do this for you. So, and also we're putting together a guide. A little report at some point will come from this project that I'm doing to try and help people with a bit of a step-by-step simplification of the process. So when that comes out, we hope that will help people too.
Rob, my final difficult question for you. Zenobe is a player in an ever-growing field of battery suppliers in the UK, Europe, globally. What makes your product stand out? 2 quick answers.
Yeah, sure. Well, what makes our product stand out is that they are coming directly from our own fleet of electric vehicles, which are currently driving around the UK. We'll soon be having hundreds of megawatt hours every year coming from a first life in a vehicle going to a second life. We'll be deploying those into the mobile systems, which you see on site. And that means that there is significant benefits in using second life batteries as opposed to first life batteries in terms of the embodied carbon that has been either incurred or paid off in the life of those batteries before they've reached your event.
Fantastic, thank you very much. I'm going to open up questions to the floor now. Hands up, please. Stunned them all into silence.
Just in terms of like pricing for the applications for the grid things, we're quite a small company and we just do like a one-off sort of festival in the summer usually. Do you think it would be worth it long term if it is just like a one-off? We do like just once a year. Do you think it's worth it going forward?
It's a tricky financial return on investment. I'll wait for you to put your headphones on. There you go. Yeah, it's a tricky financial return on investment. I'll be honest with you. I can't go into costings just yet. We're not publicising those just yet. But one of the sites we're looking at, we've got a bit of a stake in that site, but so have lots of other event companies. And so we've partnered with them, and we're collaborating with them, and we are all working together to try and put this grid connection in. So we're investing parts and they're investing parts, and so that might be your best bet. If you're putting a show on every year and it's in the same location, find out what else is going on in that location. You know, there might be scope for you to partner up, work together, and bring it about that way.
Thank you, Jenny. Any other questions?
Hiya. I just wanted to ask, what should you ask your technical team for in terms of what data is it that you need specifically to know then how to negotiate with other organisations?
Shall I?
Well, I'm gonna turn that one to Jules first, because he's getting data off the generator telemetry. And I'm going to run that past Rob because he's getting it off the inverter technology, and then we'll finish with.
So I would, Tim alluded to it earlier, and I think Robert did as well, having that data in whatever form is crucial for whatever way you want to go forward in terms of becoming more sustainable or reducing your carbon footprint, because all of the options require some sight of that data to be able to provide the best solution. We're the same, Robert's the same, the grid connection's the same. And the more detail you have that data in, the better. So essentially, for our generators, we can essentially take a trace of exactly what they're doing over time, how much power they're producing, and we can refine that down to taking a sort of half-hourly snapshot, which will give you a good overview of what the site's doing, to taking 10-second intervals what it's doing, which obviously gives you much more detail about those short transient peaks, which can be quite significant in terms of sizing your overall supply. So yeah, essentially the more data you can get and the more refined and precise that data can be, the better, but any data is better than no data at all.
Yeah, and just to add on from that, with a battery, batteries are very good at handling short spikes. They're not very good at doing high consistent loads. You're going to need a very big battery, which would cost a lot of money, and you're probably better off with a different technology. So if your technical team are saying we use 1 megawatt hour of energy over our event, that's not going to be very useful for someone trying to size the battery, because that 1 megawatt hour could have been a very low load the whole time, or no load and one massive spike, and you'll need a very different kind of technology to be able to facilitate that. So basically getting an idea of load profile, the types of loads on site, how they behave, when they're going to be running. You can generally piece together all that information to produce an estimated load profile and then design a system based on that.
Yeah. And from a grid perspective, there's a couple of things really. Firstly, when you're applying for that grid from the DNO, you need to know some of that data. You need to know how much power you need. And you also need, not to get too complex with it, but you need to understand where your disturbing loads are, your peak shavings are going to be, where your harmonics need to come into play. And all of these are words that you don't need to necessarily understand. But the DNO will ask you stuff like that, and you need that data. Secondly, when you're having conversations with artists, they always like to think they need an awful lot more power than they actually do. So having that data, when you're trying to come up with a sustainable power solution, you can fall back on that data with those conversations with the artist agents and promoters to say, you know what, so-and-so doesn't actually need 2,000 megawatts of data. We've seen that the data trends show that they don't need that, and we are perfectly fine on this sustainable solution we've got here. So it comes in handy so many times.
Fantastic. Well, that's all we've got time for, I'm afraid. Can we have a big thank you, please, for Jules, Jenny and Rob? Thanks very much for coming this afternoon, and please do visit powerfulthinking.uk.org and have a look at the resources that we have on the website. Thank you and goodbye.